There is a silence that wounds more than 1,000 words. A child who doesn't listen, who averts their gaze, who responds with disdain, or worse, with indifference. And in that absence of listening, a mother's heart quietly shatters. But what few dare to ask is, why? What lies behind this distance, this invisible barrier between parents and children? Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, delved deep into this wound, and what he discovered was not easy to accept. Because deep down, the one who ignores you may simply be trying to survive your presence. Freud said that no child is born a blank slate. From the very first days, they absorb, without filter, without judgment, everything they are exposed to. The tone of voice, the look of expectation, the unspoken demands. And so, even unintentionally, many parents become fractured mirrors in which their children can no longer see themselves. They do not ignore out of malice. They ignore because in the face of certain words, gestures, or absences, something inside them has learned to protect itself, and sometimes self-protection means silence, withdrawal, closed doors. It's cruel to think of it this way. But Freud was never gentle with illusions. For him, the child's mind is a stage where conflicts, repressions, and fears play out every day. Love, when misunderstood, can become a prison. Overprotection, a subtle form of control. Constant criticism, a reminder that they will never be good enough. And then what began as protection turns into guilt, into defense, into rejection disguised as rebellion, and what we call disobedience may actually be a silent cry for recognition. Have you ever asked yourself what's really behind your child's silence? Not the surface silence, but the one that echoes inside, shaped by years of misplaced words, subtle absences, misunderstood love. Freud invites us to look at this without fear, because according to him, what goes unacknowledged in the present becomes repetition in the future. And so the child who ignores you today may become the adult who is also ignored by their own children. A cycle fueled by the unconscious, perpetuated by generations who never learned to truly listen. If you feel like you're losing your child, that they are drifting further away, maybe this video isn't just an explanation, maybe it's a mirror. Because Freud revealed 7 profound truths. Uncomfortable, yes, but liberating. Truths that show us that sometimes the problem isn't the child. It's the wound the relationship hides. It's the unspoken truth no one dared to name. Until now. From the very first days of life, a human being does not simply emerge, they inherit. We inherit not only genetic codes, but also the emotional fragments of our parents, their neuroses, their silences, their unresolved traumas. Freud warned us that childhood is not merely a preface to life, it is the unconscious foundation upon which everything else is built. A child who ignores, who withdraws, who turns cold, does not act out of nowhere. It is the invisible echo of a home where, despite love, something essential was never truly understood, something left unsaid, something felt but never named. In Freudian psychoanalysis, everything that is repressed will return. And when that repression takes place within the earliest bonds of life, between mother and child, father and daughter, its return is always more intense, more confusing, more symbolic. The child who now ignores you may unconsciously be protecting themselves from the pain of not having been emotionally recognized. It is not about ingratitude, it is about psychic survival. To Freud, the unconscious never forgets. It merely whispers, disguised as behavior, what the conscious mind tried to bury. That is why so many parents are left bewildered by their children's coldness, because they truly believe they did their best, and perhaps they did. But what Freud shows us with brutal clarity is that love, when not emotionally decoded by the child, can be perceived as control, pressure, or even threat. The emotional language of childhood does not comprehend silent sacrifice. It understands presence, it understands validation, and when those are missing, even unintentionally, the child internalizes a void that later expresses itself through emotional distance. This is where the pain of the parent meets the silence of the child. Two worlds that love each other, but speak different emotional languages. Freud called this the family neurosis, a cycle of miscommunication fueled by good intentions and poor emotional translation. The child does not know how to express what they feel. The parent does not know how to hear what is not spoken, and so they drift apart, not from a lack of affection, but from an excess of unnamed wounds. It is in this emotional vacuum that estrangement is born. But where there is pain, there is also possibility. Freud believed that awareness is the first step to healing, and that begins the moment you dare to ask, what lies behind the behavior that wounds me? Because the child who now seems to reject you may only be carrying a burden that was never theirs. They may be trying to protect the bond in the only way they know how. And if you are willing to listen with the ears of the soul, you may find behind the silence a cry for reconnection. Freud understood that a child's mind is shaped not only by spoken words, but by the gestures that linger in the air. The avoided gazes, the denied emotions, the affections offered with conditions. It is in this ambiguous terrain that what he called the superego is formed, an internal judge born from the parental voice, internalized during early childhood. When that voice is too harsh, too critical, or simply absent, the child learns to survive by disconnecting, not only from the parent, but also from themselves. And as they grow, this discomfort is projected onto the parental figure, generating emotional resistance, withdrawal, and rejection. This is where Freud's concept of affective ambivalence comes into play, love and resentment coexisting in the same psychic space. The child loves the father but hates the feeling of inadequacy that his presence awakens, loves the mother but resents the weight of her unspoken expectations. This ambivalence is not a sign of dysfunction, it is a sign of complexity. But when ignored, it becomes silent resentment, expressed as what many parents describe as coldness or emotional distance. Beneath that distance is an overloaded emotional field. The grown child does not ignore out of spite. They ignore because the other's presence is a constant reminder of an unspoken wound. The emotional tragedy, Freud would argue, is that many parents unconsciously project their unmet dreams onto their children, treating them not as individuals, but as continuations of their own broken narratives. This turns the child into a stage, not a person. They stop being a being and start becoming an expectation, and no one can connect deeply with someone who doesn't see them as they truly are. So the emotional distance often becomes a silent act of liberation, a cry for identity, for breath, for space. Ironically, it is often in pulling away that children begin to exist as themselves. This is a painful realization. It challenges the idealized image of parenthood. But Freud never aimed to soothe illusions. His commitment was to psychic truth, no matter how uncomfortable. And the truth is, many family bonds are held more by guilt than by love, more by obligation than by emotional freedom. That's why so many homes, even without screaming, are theaters of invisible pain. A child's silence may very well be the muffled scream of an emotionally neglected past. And yet, reconstruction is possible. Freud believed that what is repressed can be reintegrated if it is recognized. The process isn't immediate, nor is it easy, but it begins with a different kind of listening, a listening that does not try to defend, justify, or correct, only to understand. Because sometimes, healing doesn't come from fixing the child, but from rewriting the parent within yourself. When Freud developed the concept of transference, he revealed one of the most complex dynamics in any meaningful relationship. We project onto others what we have not yet resolved within ourselves. And within the family, this transference becomes even more intense. A child who ignores may unconsciously be responding not only to the present father, but to the archetypal figure that father represents: authority, censorship, judgment. Likewise, a mother who is overly present may be perceived as invasive, suffocating, even if her intention is care. The conflict isn't on the surface. It's encoded in the emotional memory that lies between them. These projections create a magnetic field of tension where communication gets lost. A single no can carry centuries of frustration. A simple request may be felt as a threat to autonomy. Freud reminds us that the unconscious is timeless. It doesn't distinguish between now and then. That's why many conflicts between parents and children aren't about what's happening in the present. They're about emotional wounds that were opened before the child could even name what they felt. And when those wounds aren't tended to, the natural response is distance, not from cruelty, but from a need for psychic survival. This is when parents must pause, not to act, but to reflect. What is this rejection awakening in me? What ancient pain is being triggered when my child doesn't respond to me? Freud would point toward the importance of analysis, not as an intellectual exercise, but as an honest dive into one's own shadow. Because only when we understand the wounded child that still lives within us, can we truly begin to hear the one standing in front of us. Freud taught that repetition is the unconscious mind's call for resolution. If you notice your children reenacting patterns you once lived with your own parents, it is not coincidence, it is unconscious destiny. But destiny in psychoanalysis is not fixed. It can be rewritten if one is brave enough to face it. And that bravery begins when we stop looking for someone to blame and start searching for meaning. At this point, your child's silence can become a key, a rare chance to interrupt the cycle. But this requires something rare from a parent: emotional humility, the ability to acknowledge that even with good intentions, something was lost, and even more importantly, that it may still be found. Psychoanalysis never promised easy answers, but it offered something more valuable: clarity. And with clarity comes the possibility of liberation. Freud said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. When a child begins to pull away, it's tempting to fall into victimhood, but that reaction only reinforces the cycle. Healing begins when a parent lets go of the role of victim and steps into the role of observer. That requires listening, empathy, but above all, emotional responsibility. The child who avoids you today may be trying to protect their psychic space. Perhaps they need silence to find their voice. Perhaps they need distance to figure out who they are without the shadow of your gaze. That doesn't mean they don't love you. It means they're trying to love themselves. And for Freud, that process of individuation, though painful, is essential. Because a child who never separates emotionally from the parent remains imprisoned by expectations they never chose. Many parents mistake obedience for love. But true love, Freud believed, is the kind that allows the other to be whole, even if that means losing control. And losing control for a parent may be the ultimate act of love, because it is in that space of freedom that trust is built. The love that returns by choice is infinitely more powerful than the love that stays by obligation. In this process, reconnection can only happen through recognition. Recognition of the failures, the oversteps, the silences, not as a burden of guilt, but as an act of emotional maturity. Freud saw analysis as the mirror that allows us to finally understand what's been behind the patterns, the tension, the distance. And perhaps by the end of this journey, you will not only have a closer child, you will have recovered parts of yourself that were forgotten long ago. Because in the end, every true reunion with the other begins with an honest reunion with yourself. If we want to understand why children turn away from their parents, we must first look inward, not outward. Freud insisted that the child's behavior is never random. It is always a message, often encrypted through layers of defense, pain, and unconscious repetition. A child who ignores is often a child who no longer feels safe to be seen, not physically unsafe, but emotionally exposed. When every gesture is met with judgment, when every attempt at autonomy is interpreted as rebellion, the child's only refuge is retreat. Distance becomes a shield, and silence a survival tactic. This withdrawal is often misread as disrespect, but in truth, it is a sign of emotional saturation. Freud warned us that repression has a cost. The more we suppress, the more forcefully it returns through symptoms, behaviors, and ruptures in intimacy. What may seem like a small disagreement or attitude problem is often the tip of a much deeper iceberg. Unmet emotional needs, years of miscommunication, and a longing to be truly understood. The parent may see an attitude, the child may feel despair. The gap between those two perceptions is where the fracture grows. But here lies a hidden gift. Freud believed that symptoms are not enemies, they are messages. When a child ignores, pushes away, or grows cold, They are not rejecting you entirely. They are rejecting the version of the relationship that hurts, the authoritarian tone, the emotional absence, the conditional love. If the parent can separate their identity from their role, they may discover an unexpected path to reconnect not as an authority, but as a human being. Not to demand obedience, but to offer presence. And in doing so, the narrative can begin to shift. This shift does not require perfection. It requires vulnerability. Freud taught that healing begins not when we fix others, but when we expose our own wounds, not theatrically but authentically. A parent who can say, "I didn't know how to love you the way you needed," breaks centuries of silence. Because that sentence, that truth, gives the child permission to feel what they've never been allowed to feel, the right to their pain. And when pain is acknowledged, healing can finally begin. Through this, a new kind of bond can form, not built on obedience or guilt, but on honesty. A relationship where both are allowed to be flawed, evolving, human. And in that rawness, something sacred can emerge. Connection without expectation, love without performance, and dialogue without fear. That is where transformation begins, not in changing the child, but in rewriting the emotional contract that held both in unconscious chains. Freud's vision of human development was unapologetically complex. He saw every family as a theater of desire, repression, fear, and longing, a place where roles are scripted unconsciously, often passed down for generations. In this theater, the child is not only a character but also a mirror. They reflect not only what they've experienced, but also what the parent never dared to confront. That's why a child's resistance can feel so personal. Because it is. It touches the parent's most sensitive wounds, their hidden regrets, their unspoken traumas. A child's defiance is often a mirror held up to the parent's unmet self. When a son rejects his father's values, perhaps he is rejecting the rigidity the father endured from his father. When a daughter pushes away from her mother's suffocating love, perhaps she is refusing to repeat a pattern of emotional fusion that erased women in the family line. These aren't conscious acts. They are ancestral echoes. Freud would call it the return of the repressed, not only within individuals but across generations. But there is a way out. Intergenerational pain does not have to become intergenerational destiny. Freud believed that the act of becoming conscious, truly conscious, breaks the spell. It interrupts the repetition. It allows a parent to say, "It ends with me," not as a statement of blame, but of liberation. To do this, one must step off the stage of the old family drama and step into the uncertain space of real dialogue, a space where nothing is scripted, but everything is possible. This kind of dialogue doesn't begin with answers. It begins with presence, with questions, with a willingness to sit in discomfort, to hear things that unsettle, to accept that you too were once a child whose needs were unmet, and that this legacy shaped your parenting more than you realized. Freud never blamed parents. He invited them to become aware, because awareness dissolves the illusion of fate. It returns freedom where there once was repetition. And so, what feels like a crisis, your child ignoring you, shutting down, walking away, may actually be an opening, a chance to interrupt centuries of emotional silence. A moment to say, "I'm ready to hear what I never knew I missed." That moment can become a turning point, not just for the relationship, but for everything that relationship echoes and contains. Freud often said that the mind does not forget, it only buries. But what is buried continues to act, to speak, to shape. And so when we witness a rupture in a parent-child bond, we are not witnessing a single event. We are witnessing a culmination, a convergence of everything unspoken, unfelt, unresolved. That is why simple advice and surface-level techniques often fail. The wound isn't behavioral, it is emotional, archetypal, deeply unconscious. The healing, then, must match the depth of the wound. It cannot be rushed or forced. It must emerge, slowly, organically, truthfully. Freud compared psychoanalysis to archaeology. The analyst, like an archaeologist, gently uncovers the layers of the psyche, dusting off old pain, forgotten memories, repressed truths. In the same way, a parent must become a gentle excavator of their child's world, Not to impose, but to understand. Not to correct, but to connect. This requires an inner shift, a moving away from the question, how do I make my child respect me? And toward a deeper question, what part of me needs to be seen and why? Often it is the neglected self within the parent that cries out through the child's rejection. That part demands not obedience from the child, but recognition from the adult self. The child in ignoring awakens the wounded child in the parent, and in that moment, a sacred door opens, a chance not just to be a parent, but to become whole. In this wholeness, forgiveness becomes possible, not just between parent and child, but within. Forgiving the parent you had, forgiving the parent you became, and forgiving the child who never knew your wounds. Freud never saw healing as a return to harmony. He saw it as the ability to live with contradiction, with memory, with truth, and to love anyway. And that is the ultimate gift of this work. Not perfect relationships, but honest ones. Not children who obey without question, but children who speak with truth. Not families without conflict, but families with courage. Courage to feel, to face, and to transform. Because love, real love, is not about getting it right. It is about staying present, even when everything feels wrong. In the end, Freud's work was never about pathology. It was about humanity, about understanding that beneath every symptom, every silence, every act of rejection or withdrawal, there is a story, often untold. A story of unmet needs, inherited pain, and silent longing. A child who ignores is not closing a door. They are asking you to knock differently, not with force, with presence, with humility. The child who turns away is not trying to punish you. They are trying to protect something fragile within themselves. Freud taught us that every human being carries within a battle between their instincts and their conscience, their desires and their fears, their need for freedom and their longing for connection. And that battle plays out most intimately within the family. When the child walks away, it is often the only way they know how to stay intact. But the door is never fully closed. The unconscious, Freud believed, is always listening and always seeking resolution. When a parent begins to change their way of being, not to manipulate, but to truly grow, the child senses it. Trust is not rebuilt through lectures, but through the subtle language of consistency, vulnerability, and time. A single moment of authentic connection can do more than years of guilt or control. So if your child is distant, do not ask, how do I fix them? Ask instead, what truth must I face within myself? That shift changes everything, because it no longer seeks control. It seeks understanding. And understanding, when given sincerely, becomes an invitation. An invitation for the child to return, not to your expectations, but to a relationship where they can finally be seen as they are. That is Freud's enduring message. What we make conscious, we can change. What we dare to feel, we can transform. And in the sacred, messy, beautiful space between two wounded human beings, parent and child, lies the possibility of healing not only a relationship, but a lineage. There are moments in life when silence speaks louder than any word, when a child's absence, their coldness, or their distance is not a rejection of you, but a reflection of something deeper. Throughout this journey, we've walked through the corridors of Freud's thought, uncovering the unconscious wounds that echo between generations. We've seen that love alone is not enough. It must be understood, decoded, and offered without the chains of expectation. And perhaps the most courageous act a parent can make is not to teach, but to unlearn. To meet their child not with answers, but with presence. You now understand that every act of emotional withdrawal is not born in the present. It is seeded in memories, unspoken tensions, and inherited pain. Your child may not be ignoring you, but the emotional weight they no longer know how to carry. This doesn't make you a failure. It makes you human. Freud showed us that we are all shaped by forces beneath the surface, and it is only when we dare to look inward that the cycle begins to break. The child who pushes away might actually be longing for the version of you that they never truly met. Healing does not happen in dramatic moments. It happens in the quiet shifts, the softened voice, the honest apology, the brave vulnerability. You don't need to become a perfect parent. You need only become a conscious one. One who sees their child not as a reflection of themselves, but as a being worthy of being known. Because in the end, the deepest desire of every child, even the one who turns away, is not to be corrected, but to be understood. So if you've felt a painful distance growing between you and someone you love, take a breath. Don't chase the noise. Listen for the silence. Within it, you might find not a wall, but a door. And if you're willing to approach that door with humility and truth, it just might open. Not quickly, not easily, but slowly. In a rhythm that belongs not to control, but to connection. And if something in this video stirred something in you, a memory, a realization, a silent truth, don't let it fade. Speak it. Share it. Comment what touched you. Subscribe if you felt seen, and send this message to someone who needs to hear it. Because healing begins alone, but it multiplies when we bring it into the light.